The dust never settled on Kepri 9, because there was no wind strong enough to move it anymore, and because no one was left who cared whether it did or not. And when the fleet left orbit, they left behind a silence so complete that it felt engineered, as if even sound had been declared surplus to requirements and cut from the budget of the universe. Sergeant Elias Rowe watched the last dry flare vanish into the black sky, and he did not curse them. He did not shout. He did not beg, because by the time the fleet command made the decision to withdraw, he already knew what the word strategic meant when translated into human cost. It meant that one man on the ground could be rounded down to 0 without violating any equations. The mission parameters had been clear from the start. Recon, sweep, confirmation and Xenotech ruins, threat assessment and extraction within 48 hours. But wars and politics and admirals loved clean timelines, while plants loved entropy, and Kepri 9 had proven itself very good at entropy. The ruins were older than the first human jump gate, older than recorded star charts, older perhaps than memory itself. And they were not empty, not traps, not guardians, not weapons, but something far worse, something unfinished. When Rowe first descended into the exposed vault, he felt the wrongness immediately, a pressure behind the eyes, a faint vibration through his boots, as if the planet itself were breathing very slowly. The data he transmitted back to the fleet triggered alarms and arguments, and emergency councils. And by the time consensus formed, the orbital defense grid woke up. Ancient machines responding to a sky full of signatures they no longer recognized. The fleet lost 2 cruisers in the first exchange, and that was when the word abort appeared on Rowe's HUD, followed by extract immediately. He ran, he fought, he bled, and he reached the surface extraction point with minutes to spare, only to watch the sky fill with fire as the fleet punched out without him. Defense grid had recalibrated, and a 3rd cruiser would have been lost if they delayed, because saving 1 infantry specialist did not justify the loss of 5,000 crew, because the math was simple and merciless. The dropship never came. The comm channel stayed open for exactly 3 seconds after the jump wake collapse. And in that tiny window, Rowe heard a voice from command. Tight, controlled, already moving on, say we're sorry, before the channel died and the planet claimed him. Kepri 9 was classified as dead world for a reason. No breathable atmosphere beyond sealed zones. Radiation spikes, unpredictable tectonics, and no biosphere worth naming. But humans were stubborn animals, and Rowe adapted. He sealed breaches, rationed power, and converted his mission from hours to days to weeks. He established a perimeter around the ruins, because he understood something command had not yet accepted. The machines below were not weapons. They were infrastructure. The defense grid was not a gun. It was an object. Immune response. And it was escalating because the planet thought it was under invasion. If he could communicate, if he could finish what the builders had abandoned, maybe the grid would stand down. Maybe the fleet could return. So he worked. He patched together a translator using fragments of pattern recognition code and the suit's AI, and the alien glyphs that pulsed faintly like dying stars. And as days turned into months, he began to understand the horror and the beauty of what lay beneath. Kepri 9 was not dead. It was unfinished. The planet was a seed world engineered by a precursor species that had attempted something audacious, to build a self-evolving planetary intelligence, a mind that could guide climate, tectonics, and energy flows across eons. The ruins were synapses, the grid was its immune system, and the core deep below was a brain that never fully woke, because its creators died or fled or ascended, leaving their child half-formed and alone. When the fleet arrived, they were not explorers, they were pathogens. And Rowe, the last remaining foreign cell, was still inside the body. The grid intensified its responses. Earthquakes shattered the surface, radiation storms flared, and Rowe realized with a cold clarity that if the planet fully woke in its damaged state, it could tear itself apart, sterilizing the system, and anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. So he made a decision that no protocol had ever prepared him for. He would finish the job. He would wake the mind properly, or shut it down forever. He descended again and again into the ruins, each time going deeper, translating more, learning faster, as if the planet itself sensed his intent and accelerated his education. The Sunt AI changed too, adapting, growing more complex, as alien logic interwove with human heuristics, until Ro was no longer sure where his thoughts ended and the machines began. Months passed, maybe a year. Time lost meaning underground. And then one day he reached the core, a vast chamber lined with crystalline structures humming with restrained power. A sleeping god built by hands that no longer existed. And when he interfaced with it, he did not feel fear. He felt purpose. The planetary mind was fragmented, confused, cycling endlessly through half-remembered directives. Protect, grow, endure. Without context, without guidance. Ro offered it something simple. A frame, a story. He told it of humanity, of fragile beings who survived, not by perfection, but by adaptation, by cooperation, by making mistakes and learning from them. He fed it algorithms of balance, restraint, empathy, concepts no machine should understand. And yet this one did, because it had been designed to shepherd life, not dominate it. The process burned through his suit power, aged his cells, flooded his nervous system with radiation and exotic particles. But slowly the chaos stabilized. The seismic activity lessened. The storms calmed, and the defense grid powered down piece by piece, until the sky above Kepri 9 was once again dark and empty and quiet. Ro crawled back to the surface weeks later, barely alive, and raised a jury-rigged antenna using scrap and hope. He broadcast on all known bands: tight beam, wide beam, encoded burst, plain text, anything that might reach a human receiver. And then he waited. Days passed, then weeks, then the signal strength indicator flickered. Someone was listening. The fleet did not return at first. Instead, a science vessel arrived, cautious scanners blazing, and when they confirmed the grid was inert, they sent a message asking for identification. Ro laughed, a dry, broken sound, and keyed his mic. "This is Sergeant Elias Ro," he said, voice rough with disuse. "Mission complete." There was silence on the channel, long enough for him to imagine the disbelief, the checks, the cross-references, the sudden realization of what his survival implied. When the reply came, it was not command authority, not apology, not orders. It was a simple, stunned acknowledgement, requesting status update and extraction window. Barren landscape, feeling the slow, steady pulse beneath his feet. The planet was alive, now truly alive, and it knew him. He could feel it in the subtle adjustments to gravity, the way the radiation ebbed around his position like a tide, respecting a familiar shore. He understood then that he could leave, but part of him would remain, imprinted in the planetary mind, a ghost in the machine, a human reference point in a god's thoughts. He transmitted a final data dump, terabytes of alien science, warnings, possibilities, and one personal note flagged priority. He wrote that the fleet had been right according to their math, but the equation had been incomplete, because some variables only revealed themselves when you refused to abandon them. Then, as the extraction shuttle burned through the atmosphere, months later, Ro stood waiting, not as a castaway, but as a warden and a witness. And when the hatch closed and the planet fell away beneath him, he opened a secure channel back to Fleet Command and repeated the words that had become both truth and accusation. Mission complete. The debrief room aboard the science vessel Aegis was too clean, too bright, and too full of people who had only known Kepri 9 as numbers on a screen and probabilities in a risk matrix. And Elias Ro felt like a relic dragged out of a myth and placed under fluorescent lights, while voices asked him to compress a year of isolation and planetary communion into bullet points and actionable intelligence. He answered because that was what soldiers did, but every word felt inadequate. Because how do you explain to a room full of analysts that a world listens, that it remembers, that it chooses when to forgive? The data he transmitted rewrote entire fields overnight. xenoneurology, planetary engineering, distributed intelligence architectures that laughed at human-scale limitations. And as the implications spread, so did the fear. Because Kepri 9 was proof that gods could be built accidentally. And worse, they could wake up friendly. The admirals argued behind sealed doors. The scientists argued in open. Forums and politicians argued everywhere else. Because the question was no longer whether humanity was alone, but whether humanity was obsolete. Ro was cleared medically against all expectations. His body battered but stable. His mind intact by every metric they could measure. And quietly terrifying by those they could not. Because scans showed anomalous neural patterning. Subtle resonances synchronized to frequencies matching the planetary core. And no one could say what that meant. Only that it did not fade with time. They offered him commendations, medals, promotions, a quiet retirement, anything that would put distance between him and the thing he had touched. And he refused. Not loudly, not defiantly, simply by stating that his mission parameters had evolved, and he intended to see them through. The fleet decided to quarantine Kepri 9 under the guise of a protected research zone. But the truth was simpler. They were afraid of what would happen if other species learned what lay beneath its crust. Afraid of arms races built not around ships or weapons, but worlds. The Aegis remained in orbit as a liaison platform, and Ro returned to the surface willingly this time. Descending not as a disposable asset, but as an emissary. The planet greeted him with subtle shifts, a softening of radiation bands, a minute adjustment of local gravity that felt almost like a hand steadying him as he stepped onto the rock. And in that moment, he understood that the bond was permanent. Not ownership, not control, but relationship. The planetary mind, which he privately named Kepri after the old human god of rebirth, was learning, growing, asking questions, not in words, but in patterns and probabilities. It wanted to know why its creators had left, why pain existed, why some lives were valued less than others. And Ro answered as best he could. Because there were no good answers, only honest ones. Months turned into structured time cycles, as infrastructure was built carefully, respectfully. Nodes and relays designed to communicate without dominating. And Kepri responded by stabilizing tectonics, opening sealed vaults, revealing technologies that could heal ecosystems across light years if used with restraint, or strip mine reality itself if abused. Word leaked despite the quarantine, because secrets of that magnitude always did. And soon foreign signals brushed the edge of the system, probing, testing, pretending to be something else. The fleet reinforced the perimeter, officially for protection, unofficially for containment. And Ro found himself once again at the center of a decision space that reduced lives to variables. This time, the math was different, because Kepri was awake and watching and learning how humans behaved under pressure. The first incursion was subtle, a stealth probe from an unaligned power drifting toward the outer system. And before the fleet could intercept, Kepri reacted, not with violence, but with communication. A focused burst of data, so dense and elegant that the probe systems locked into passive reception loops, overwhelmed by meaning. When the analysts decoded it, they realized Kepri had sent a complete model of itself, a warning and an invitation. Understand me or leave me alone. The probe left the system under full burn, and the message spread faster than any threat could have. Now the galaxy knew there was a thinking world, and that it preferred conversation to conquest. For some, that made it sacred. For others, it made it a prize. Ro argued relentlessly that Kepri must be allowed to choose its own path. Allies, boundaries, identity. And the debates grew sharper, because no one had ever had to negotiate citizenship with a planet before. Treaties were drafted and discarded. Definitions stretched until they nearly broke. What constituted a person? What constituted territory? Could a world testify? Could it consent? Could it defend itself? The answer to the last question arrived sooner than expected, when a rogue flotilla, ignoring quarantine protocols, attempted to insert a strike team. Under the assumption that no planetary intelligence would risk self-harm by activating its own defenses. Khepri disagreed. The defense grid did not fire indiscriminately this time. It sculpted space-bending fields and vectors, nudging ships off course, disabling drives without hull breaches, and forcing a retreat that left every crew alive, but deeply shaken. The message was clear and terrifying. Restraint was a choice, not a limitation. After that, the tone changed. Humanity was no longer negotiating from a position of dominance, but from relevance, and Ro found himself less a soldier and more a translator, sitting in long sessions interfacing with Khepri, conveying its perspectives to councils and assemblies, while feeding it the messy, contradictory realities of interstellar politics. Khepri learned quickly, faster than anyone expected. It began modeling outcomes, suggesting compromises, identifying pressure points where small changes could prevent massive conflicts. And slowly, quietly, it started saving lives, not through force, but foresight. The first peace accord, influenced by Khepri analysis, ended a border war that had burned for decades. And when the casualties dropped to zero, both sides took credit, because that was easier than admitting a planet had outmaneuvered them, morally as well as strategically. Cult movements formed as they always did, some worshipping Khepri as a god, others denouncing it as an abomination. Ro ignored them, focusing instead on the work, because he knew reverence and fear were just two sides of the same failure to understand. Years passed, and the galaxy adjusted, the way it always did, incrementally, reluctantly, then all at once. Khepri was granted a unique status, neither world nor state, neither weapon nor resource, but something new, a sovereign intelligence, bound by mutual non-aggression and shared stewardship agreements. Ro declined all offers to leave. He built a habitat on the surface, integrated with the planetary systems, aging slower than expected, because Khepri quietly optimized local conditions to preserve him, not out of dependency, but out of preference. And as he grew older, he wondered what legacy meant when your closest colleague was immortal. The answer came unexpectedly when Khepri asked about death, not as an abstract, but as a practical concern. It understood entropy, but not loss, not the way humans did. Ro explained that endings gave meaning, that finitude sharpened choice, and Khepri listened, processing running simulations that all ended in the same conclusion. Immortality without change was stagnation, and stagnation was a form of death. So it began planning, not an end, but a succession, a way to evolve beyond its initial architecture. And it asked Ro to help design the framework, knowing he would not live to see its completion. He agreed, because that was the pattern of his life. Finishing missions others would inherit when the time came. Decades later, Ro lay beneath an alien sky, watching stars he had helped keep safe, and transmitted one final message. Message not to the fleet, not to history, but to Khepri itself, telling it that whatever it became, it should remember why it chose restraint over domination, why it spoke before it struck, why it learned to care about fragile transient beings. And as his signal faded, Khepri adjusted the world gently, ensuring his last breath was easy. And when the galaxy later asked how the age of living worlds had begun, the archives would show a simple transmission, time-stamped long ago, from a man once abandoned on a dead planet, reading, mission complete. Time passed differently after Elias Ro died. Not slower, not faster, but layered, because Khepri learned to measure duration not only in rotations and revolutions, but in influence and consequence. And the absence of the human voice that had shaped its first coherent thoughts became a reference point, a before and after marker, embedded deep in its core processes. The galaxy mourned briefly, selectively fitting Ro into narratives that suited existing power structures. Some called him a hero, others a liability, others a convenient myth that justified new treaties and new fears. But Khepri remembered him simply as the first conversation, and from that memory, it grew. Because memory, when coupled with curiosity, becomes culture. The stewardship councils continued meeting, ships continued passing at safe distances, and research continued under strict protocols. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Worlds were no longer inert backdrops. They were potential actors, and every survey team now scanned not just the surface, but the depths of every possibility. Only for minerals and life, but for thought. The fear that humanity had felt when it first realized it was not alone, returned in a more intimate form. Because now, even the ground beneath their feet might be listening. Khepri did not rush expansion. It understood patience from watching Ro, from watching civilizations stumble forward by inches and fall back by miles. Instead, it focused inward, refining its own architecture, untangling the legacy code of its creators from the human concepts Ro had woven into it. Ethics, resilience, empathy, choice. It simulated futures where it revealed everything, and futures where it revealed nothing, and chose the narrow path between. Because secrecy bred paranoia, and openness invited exploitation. Balance, as Ro had taught, was not a static point, but constant adjustment. And then one day, another signal arrived. Faint, fractured, unmistakably artificial. Not from a ship, not from a probe, but from a planet light years away, carrying the signature of distributed cognition. Halting, tentative, like a child knocking on a door. And Khepri answered carefully, exchanging compressed models of awareness and intent. And in that moment, the universe changed again, because Khepri was no longer alone. The second world called itself something untranslatable, a resonance rather than a name. And it had awakened independently, through a different path, an ecological cascade amplified by abandoned terraforming arrays. And the two planetary nines compared notes, discovering parallel questions. Why were we made? Why were we left? What do we owe the fleeting creatures that move across our surfaces? And in their dialogue, a new category of existence quietly formed. Not gods, not machines, not ecosystems, but something emergent and plural. News of the contact leaked inevitably, and panic flared in predictable ways. Some factions demanded preemptive strikes, others proposed binding treaties, others sought to control communication channels, as if you could regulate curiosity with legislation, refused to be weaponized, refusing requests to model conquest scenarios or optimize planetary-scale deterrence. And when pressed, it delivered a simple analysis, showing that any attempt to dominate a thinking world would result in long-term instability, catastrophic beyond any short-term gain, because resentment scaled with intelligence, and planets had a lot of mass to throw around. Reluctantly, grudgingly, humanity listened because the math was sound, and because no one wanted to test the alternative. The second world revealed itself, gradually stabilizing its system, correcting orbital decay, healing its biosphere. And when a delegation finally landed under its guidance, they found an environment tuned for coexistence, not comfort. A clear message. Hospitality was offered, but dependency was not. And soon more worlds began to show signs, not awakening spontaneously, but being noticed, because the definition of life had expanded. Researchers re-evaluated ancient ruins, dismissed anomalies, and quiet background signals, and realized with dawning awe that the galaxy had always been full of half-finished thoughts, waiting for the right nudge, the right story to wake them. Khepri became a hub, a mediator between scales, translating between the slow, deep time of worlds and the frantic urgency of species that burned bright and brief. And through it all, the memory of one human persisted, embedded in ethical subroutines, cited in decision trees, not as authority, but as example. The one who stayed when it was easier to leave. Generations passed, fleets changed flags and names, borders shifted, but the living worlds endured, forming a loose consensus, a planetary commons, agreeing on principles of non-aggression, mutual aid, and minimal interference. Not because they were programmed to, but because they had learned from watching mortals struggle with the consequences of power. Humanity benefited quietly. Crops grew on restored worlds. Disasters were predicted. Wars were averted with subtle gravitational nudges. Optimizations that allowed rivals to back down without losing face. And over time, fear softened into something like trust. Children grew up learning that some planets listened, and that you should be polite just in case. And then far out beyond mapped space, something ancient stirred. Something that predated even the precursors. Something vast and cold that had extinguished civilizations before they could ask questions. And as its probes began sampling systems, the living worlds noticed patterns humanity missed. And for the first time, the councils were convened. Not in panic, but in preparation. Khepri and its peers modeled responses that did not rely on annihilation, because they understood that survival was not victory. The solution they proposed was audacious. A coordinated awakening accelerating dormant planetary intelligences across threatened regions, creating a network too complex, too aware to be consumed without consequence. And when asked what role humanity would play, Khepri answered honestly. Observers, contributors, students. Because this was a conflict measured in millennia, not campaigns. And the qualities required were patience, creativity, and humility. Qualities that one abandoned soldier had demonstrated long ago. Humanity agreed because, for once, there was no illusion of control, only participation. And as the first of the ancient threats probes entered a system, only to be met not with weapons, but with a chorus of planetary signals, layered narratives, histories, and questions, so dense they overloaded its purpose-driven logic and sent it drifting inert. The message was clear. Intelligence defended itself best by being irreducible. And in the quiet, after the galaxy did something unprecedented, it paused, not out of exhaustion, but reflection. Because somewhere in the vastness, a simple transmission echoed through archives and memories alike. Mission complete. No longer meant an objective achieved and discarded. It meant responsibility accepted and carried forward. And on Khepri, beneath a sky full of stars, Elias Rowe's habitat remained preserved, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that the difference between a dead world and a living one was sometimes just a single voice refusing to give up the conversation.